Thanks very much for inviting me to the event. I said that right. I'll try and speak up. I thought I'd start with a small presentation and then hear from you all, questions, comments, criticisms, outrages, etc. I want to start first with a story about a canal. And it was part of old New Orleans history that I had to research myself in order to figure out why it is that people who have lived here all their lives and who live here now behave the way they do. Because when I set out to write my novel, I wanted to make it realistic, believable, for it to make sense, for there to be a rational relationship between the way the characters acted and the place where they came from. And I went into the history books. I'm not a historian, but I did enough, what I think is responsible research, enough so that it had a relationship to the characters that I invented. And the canal that I'm speaking of was known as the Carondelet Canal. That was the canal that went from Bayou St. John to the river and ended up behind the French Quarter right there in Basin Street. Basin Street, as we all know, is called Basin Street. That was the turnaround for that canal. And the reason why you had to have canals coming in from the lake is because before steam power, when you sailed from Europe, it was very, very difficult to sail up the Mississippi. And I didn't know any of this. So what you did was you sailed along the Gulf Coast, Mobile, Bay St. Louis, into Lake Borgne, through the Rigolets, which is the Bosporus of South Louisiana, into Lake Pontchartrain, and then Bayou St. John got you almost to the city, which was built where it is because that's the highest ground there was. And there was an old Indian portage that the merchants of early New Orleans used, and they would cart it from the end of where Bayou St. John was to the French Quarter. Under Governor Carondelet, Spanish governor, at the very end of the Spanish period of old New Orleans, they built a canal. It was called the Carondelet Canal. And that canal was a big money maker. People were starting to come into the city from all over the place. There was lots and lots of money to be made. And the canal really helped that. And the people that owned the property where the canal ended got rich because of that. And those were the French. They were the French Catholic early settlers. And so as the French enjoyed this brief period of prosperity, the Americans figured out, and they were not Catholic, they were Episcopalian, Protestant, whatever, all the other denominations. They moved in, and they wanted a piece of this action. But they had a hard time getting in on what the French Catholics had control over, which was this economic area at the end of the Carondelet Canal. And the beginning of the antipathy between the English, Protestant, American New Orleanians and the French Catholic New Orleanians started because of that. So what happened next was more and more Americans came to the city and began to threaten the political hegemony of the French Catholics. And the antipathy then really got going. So much so that a guy named Samuel Jarvis Peters, you've heard of S.J. Peters. There's Jefferson Avenue used to be called Peters Avenue. There's an S.J. Peters Elementary School. I think he's one of the most important people in New Orleans history, period. You never hear about him, you never read about him. But what he did was he got a consortium of investors, American investors, and tried to buy up that very valuable property from the French Catholics at the end of the French Quarter. Meanwhile, the French Catholics sensed a threat to, as I say, their economic and political hegemony. The Haitian Revolution happens. So all the French Catholics in town wanted all these displaced Haitians to come in and live in the city because it increased the number of French Catholics. And that included free blacks and all the rest of it, anybody back at a time when it was more important to be French and Catholic instead of black or white or anything else than it was to be American and Protestant. So S.J. Peters figures out that he's going to make an offer on Bernard Mariny's farm. All right? Bernard Mariny's farm is right there where the mint is now. And he was subdividing that farm, and he's going to sell it to an interested buyer. When he found out that S.J. Peters was going to be the buyer, he didn't want that because he was not Catholic and he was not French. So he double-crossed him at the sale closing. He invited him to come, brought him over there, agreed on a price. Peters was ready to buy that farm and develop his own American neighborhood right there in the middle of solid French neighborhood. Bernard Mariny double-crossed him and said, I'm sorry, I can't sell it. My sister's not here. She owns half. Sorry. Samuel Jarvis Peters swore revenge, and he says this in his biography, against the French Catholics. And by then, the French Catholics and the American Protestants were at war. So Samuel Jarvis Peters then goes to Bernard Mariny's sister and says, I'll buy your farm. And her farm was what is now the Garden District. That was called the Liverday Plantation back then. It was purchased by Samuel Jarvis Peters. And in 1829, around that, he bought it and he established a new residential community for Protestant Americans. By that time, the city had been divided into 3 municipalities. So you had Marigny was one municipality, and Bywater. The CBD area was another municipality, and then the French Quarter was the main municipality. And so what happened was the Americans then got taxing authority over their own district, which they had never had before. Now they could raise their own money through the mechanism of taxation. And that was huge because that meant they could build their own canal. And that's who built the New Basin Canal, which, as you know, went down West End Boulevard right back there into the Greyhound Amtrak station and unloaded all of its cargo into the CBD area where all the Americans were, except for this thing was much wider, much longer, much faster, much easier, much more valuable. And that was the beginning of the end of the French Catholic economic stranglehold they had on the city. Eventually, the Carondelet Canal, which is a skinny little stupid thing, just shriveled up, and by 1920, it was dead. So, what I like to know was, why are there vestiges of that antipathy, which was political, social, psychosocial, and economic, that began way back then, still exists a little bit today? Furthermore, there was the same sort of antipathy that developed between the free black Catholics and the Protestant country enslaved blacks before the Civil War. They wouldn't mix. As a matter of fact, the free blacks owned slaves of their own and all that stuff. The Civil War comes along, and all of a sudden, all blacks are lumped into one category, and all whites are lumped into one category. And so the free blacks that were in the French part of New Orleans, who had enjoyed social acceptance, economic freedom, they had the ability to sue and be on boards and own banks, everything. They were just like regular French citizens. All of a sudden, after the Civil War, they get shoved in, because of the color of their skin, or to a racial group that they had always felt superior to. So I've got to figure out, are there vestiges of those kind of, that resentment, the resentment between the formerly free French free blacks and their Protestant enslaved brethren, and why is there antipathy that still remains, if there is, between the French and the French Catholics and the American Protestants, and does that still exist today? In the meantime, you had a Jewish immigration that occurred in the 1830s from Germany, mainly from Alsace, which is kind of closer to Prussia, who had assimilated into New Orleans society, and by 1920, they were just like regular people until Eastern European Jewish people came. All of a sudden, the assimilated, very sophisticated, and very successful portion of the Jewish society got lumped in to this new weird-looking, stinky food, Eastern Europeans with beards and hair, and they just, non-assimilated Jews. Is there a resentment that still exists between that group of the Jewish community and the new Eastern European group of the Jewish community? So now, for the purposes of my novel, I've got what I think I've set up, in my mind anyway, like a three-tiered parallel animosity. The French hate the Americans, the free blacks hate the darker blacks, the old Jews hate the new Jews. That, to me, was the perfect way to set up a cross-bracing in a novel. You've seen it before in all kind of novels. Like, for example, in Gone with the Wind, not the movie, but the book, the relationship between Mrs. O'Hara and Scarlett is supposed to parallel the relationship between Mammy and her daughter, which is not developed in the movie, but it's a way to set up character development and understanding for the reader and those interactions and how they work. So I thought I had a nice little concept about the story of New Orleans. And there was a part of the city that it's not written about. This is not a city of vampires. It's not a city of voodoo. It's not a city of second lines, as many as there are downtown. They're not part of our daily lives. And they're not part of anybody's daily life who lives here, which is much more interesting than voodoo and how much glitter you can put on a shoe and how many haunted houses there are in the French Quarter. That's all very romantic, and there's a way to capitalize on it. Literally, you can make money on it. But it is not the interesting part of what we all live as our daily lives. So, that was kind of the psychological, historical background I had to put together through research and other means and personal experience to start crafting a story. But I needed a premise. So I was reading, I don't know if you ever read The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad. It's a story about an agent provocateur in England, in London, who is hired by the Russian communists to blow up the Greenwich Observatory. And he gives the bomb to his retarded brother-in-law, and the brother-in-law slips and falls on the way to planting the bomb and blows himself up. And it was a story that Conrad based on a tiny little article in the London Times about guy blows up carrying bomb in the middle of Greenwich Park. No one knew really what the background was. So Conrad just invented this entire background, this whole story about communist agents and retarded children and his wife's affair, all this wild stuff that was never based on anything other than he was filling in a character study inside of a little story that he had read. So we've all know the story of the sniper incident at the Howard Johnsons, right? What is really behind that story? Well, I took on the same objective as Conrad did, not as successfully, obviously. Not the genius he is, but I invented this whole story around the characters that led up to the sniper incident. And it's all not true, and some of you might even know the story of the sniper incident. It was a guy that was in the Navy from Kansas, came down here to follow his buddy in the middle of the Black Panther movement. He goes on a crime spree that lasted really a week and a half. I didn't know this until I researched it. He started out by killing a greengrocer off Earhart Expressway, not Expressway, Earhart Boulevard. And then a week later, he goes into the Howard Johnson, gets on the roof and starts shooting people. We all know the story. I'd never been to the Howard Johnson, so I can't set my novel in the Howard Johnson, but one hotel that I do know is the Pontchartrain Hotel, because I worked there. I was a shipping and receiving clerk. And part of my job was to run the service elevator. It was one of those old-fashioned service elevators that has it's a manually operated thing. And I had access to all the floors and everything. It was a lot of fun. The wine cellar was on the 13th floor. You might be interested to know. But I knew every inch of that hotel. So I knew that I could center this new fictionalized version of the sniper incident in the Pontchartrain because I could get the characters to inhabit the Pontchartrain Hotel because I knew it so well. Now, I was also a dishwasher at the Gumbo Shop. Remember Harry Roberts owned the Gumbo Shop? Very briefly, he opened up a gumbo shop on Britannia right across from the CVS. In the old days, there's McKinsey's there. You know that block. I was a dishwasher there. And while I was a dishwasher, there was a flood. And the manager told me to go get all the linens that were stored, freshly pressed linens, and sop up all the water. And so I took all the linens, like you said, I said, you want to use fresh linens to stop a bunch of water? I want you to just use a mop. He said, get the fresh linens, you dishwasher, and do as I say. Yeah, so I got the linens, and I go, and who walks in? Harry Roberts. And what does he say? What the hell are you doing with all the fresh linens? I'm sorry, Billy Roberts. Harry was his son. He was my age. So I had a choice right there. I could rat out the manager and say, it wasn't my decision. This guy, who I hate, told me to do it. I didn't do that. I'm not a rat. So I just accepted the blame for it and took my lumps from Billy Roberts. A few years ago, I asked him if he remembered that story. He said, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But it was an important moment to me. And it was one that I could use for the turning point of the story. I don't know if you read the book, but if you have, you remember. There's a dishwasher, and he's told by his manager, who is, there's another aspect, he's a Mexican guy, but he's pretending to be Argentinian. You see, because Argentinians look down on Mexicans. The same way all these other people that we've talked about look down on each other. It's just going on all the time. Even in the bowels of the Pontchartrain Hotel, you got this action happening, which is it's a natural human, just like at Lambeth House, there's a natural hierarchical thing happening over there. You can't stop it. It's going to happen no matter what group you're talking about. My godfather, Louis Perriott, some of you know, told me a story that he saw a maitre d' in the men's room, and he was dipping his little finger in the lilac blossoms and rubbing the pollen on his eyes as eyeshadow. He was a gay guy, and my Uncle Louis thought that was very funny. Told me this story. So I had this idea. I'm going to make this Argentine/Mexican gay guy that puts eyeshadow on screaming at the manager for telling me, the dishwasher, or the character, the dishwasher, to sop up all the stuff with fresh linen. So you take, when you're writing a story, which you can plan out, things you've heard, stories Uncle Louie tells you, Billy Roberts yelling at you when you're a dishwasher, and you start bringing them all together. And so then you start getting a book. And it started to take shape. And this is what happened with me. The book started to take shape. And I felt like it was a tight little ball of a story. It was all laced up, intertwined together, which I think makes for pleasant reading. I don't know. It makes for easier reading, and it makes for an understanding of the reason why the characters behave. I know it drives you crazy like it drives me. You watch these Netflix series and you say, these people are not behaving rationally. Why don't you call the police? That idea never occurs to the people when they're in their greatest distress on Netflix for some reason. I didn't want to have people say, the characters in your book are not behaving rationally. So there had to be a psychological, ethic, social, and realistic basis for their behavior to make the book realistic. So there you go. I had something there in a book. The next thing I had to figure out was, well, what is the style? What is my style going to be? I don't have a style. I've never written a book. I don't have any style. I've seen style. I don't know what it can be. So I had to go back and read and start paying attention to the things that I read in fiction and see what style was all about. One of the things which you read, if you have read the book, or you will read when you read the book, is the employment of lists. You recall this lists of things, which is it goes back to the Iliad. Book 5 of the Iliad is a catalog of ships. It's just a list of the ships and who's on them. And it's great. You don't have to worry about grammar. And it gives a definitive texture to what you're describing. And so I found that very useful when I had to describe, well, this is what they serve here. This is the kind of cars that are lined up here. This is whatever. And I started to develop a style around that. Of course, you still had to tell the narrative, but interspersed, it was a very easy way. And I was going to read one example I hate being read to. They tell you as a lawyer, never read to a judge. But I might just read this one section just to give you an example of how I employ the list. This is a part of the story where the uptown stockbroker who's an Episcopalian, who is married to a Catholic girl who his mother hates because she hates Catholics. And the way she expresses it, because she can't say, I hate Catholics, is that she becomes a big proponent of Planned Parenthood. That's the way she expresses her hatred for Catholics. She gives money to Planned Parenthood. It's very difficult for Episcopalians to look down on Catholics the way they do in the Northeast, because the French Catholics were aristocrats here before they were. So they can't very well say, oh, this is scum. They want to say, oh, the Italians, the Irish, the smelly food, low rent. They can't exactly do that here. It's more difficult, which is a part of what makes the interrelationships among the various groups in the city interesting. Much more interesting than vampires and glitter and the Endymion extravaganza. This is not interesting. What is really interesting is the real stuff that goes on. So this character is getting ready to go downtown. He's gotten himself into a bad financial shape, keeping up with the Joneses. We all know what that means. He's got to buy a fishing camp. He has to have twin outboard motors on his Boston Whaler. He's got to have vacation trips to watercolor. He's got to live uptown and pay an unbelievable tax burden. And he's having an affair at the same time. It's all just caving in on him. So he has the idea, I'm going to buy a lottery ticket. This is how desperate he is. He thinks buying a lottery ticket's going to be his salvation from the situation that he's in. So on the way from his house on, wherever it was I said, Coliseum, downtown, he stops at the Time Saver, what we all used to call Time Savers. I don't know what they're called now. And he's going to buy a lottery ticket. I'll read you this one short section, see if you like it. As he pulled out of the driveway, he convinced himself that he had just enough time to stop on the way to work to buy a lottery ticket. He pulled into the local Palestinian-run quick shop mini-mart and took his place in line behind the usual fortune seekers. The poorest black inhabitants of New Orleans waiting like spent electrical vacuum tubes to buy quick play, scratch-off lottery tickets with clever Louisiana-themed names crafted to titillate the lowest possible consumer profile. Titles like Mayhaw Mayhem, Riverboat Rambler, Honey Allen Hootenanny, Streetcar Named Retire, Cochon de Play, and Wild Pelican that the clerks would tear from perforated rolls of metallicized cardboard upon request. It was beyond embarrassing for him to queue up in these bodegas surrounded by sale racks of, and here comes the list, white T-shirts, impulse buy display cases stocked with Phillies strawberry blunts, Al Capone sweet cigars, incense, car deodorizers, cookie cut from light gauge cardboard in the shape of cartoon Christmas trees, fragrance oils, air fresheners, glass smoking pipes, black nylon skull covers, lighters, energy drinks, pepper spray, prepaid cell phones, prepaid credit cards, fake flowers in slender glass test tubes, playing cards, stash trays, smoker cozies, brass pipe screens, black automotive hose repair tape, dried meat snacks, WICEBT and SNAP signs, fake Fraternal Order of Police stick-ons, static cling window lettering kits, all of the accoutrements and regalia of urban mischief. That's taken right from the catalog of ships in the Iliad, or from Francois Rabelais' description of what he had for, if Gargantua had for lunch. I don't know if you ever read Francois Rabelais. It's completely incomprehensible. He's a French writer from the 16th century. He describes in about 40,000 words what this giant had for lunch. And the chapter is something called How I Ate 6 Pilgrims in a Salad. I don't know what that means. It's Francois Rabelais. But he does the same kind of lists. Zola did the same thing in The Marketplaces of Paris in his series on Second Empire Paris. You may have read some of that. So that is how the book got constructed. And then over time, it got refined and refined and refined until I thought I brought to the reader an understanding of the a simulacrum of what life is like every day for those of us who live here every day and do everyday things. We go to the Time Saver. We stand in line. We got to wait for the guy who's buying a lottery ticket. We got to deal with the fact that our boss is yelling at us for mopping up the stupid flood with the fresh linens. These are mundane, stupid little things, but they're real, and they organize our behavior as we go through our lives here. That is what I thought I put into the book, and that is what I set out to do, and that is what we got. Whether I succeeded, that's entirely up to you. but I certainly thank you for having me, and would love to hear some questions or comments or any kind of conversation anybody would like to have. But thank you very kindly.
Anybody have any questions?
Yes, several of us have read the book, and we were curious on, I think I better understand after hearing you speak about the title. How did you end up picking that title?
Okay, the question was the title. Well, I was at Mass one Sunday, as I am every Sunday. Not even close. But there was a passage. You sometimes get bored, let's admit it, at Mass. But it's always fun to read the Old Testament stuff because it got this crazy kind of wording the way they use and these weird places they come from. And the title, Quench the Smoldering Wick, comes from a passage in Isaiah. He will not break the bruised reed. He will not quench the smoldering wick until he brings justice to victory. And what that is Isaiah. There were 3 Isaiahs. I had to learn this. Late Isaiah was the one that was writing about the Babylonian captivity, when Babylon captured the aristocrats, which means the clergy of Jerusalem, and brought them to Babylon. And they began to become assimilated to the Babylonians. In fact, the language Aramaic was invented. It's a combination of Arabic, or whatever they were speaking in Babylon, and Hebrew. That's what Aramaic is. And that's when it was developed in Babylon during the Babylonian captivity. And what Isaiah was writing was he was preaching to this group of aristocratic Jews in Babylon not to give up the faith, to keep the faith. We realize that your wick is smoldering. We realize that your reed is bruised, but don't give up. There will be salvation. And he was ultimately right. And the Jews returned to the area of Judea, Palestine, Israel. And they brought Aramaic with them, which is what the language that Jesus and a lot of those people spoke forevermore throughout the centuries. So I liked the way that wording was. Quench the smoldering wick. It was a combination of things I had never heard put together in that way before. And I thought it made a snappy title. Also, it is a typical novelistic kind of a title that begs the question. In other words, it purports to answer the question that it raises. A lot of people use begging the question now to mean raise the question. Begging the question is an entirely different animal. Begging the question is when you say, like my brother tells me, did you know the triangles are the most strong shape in the world known to man? This just begs the question. You immediately start thinking, what is he talking? I know a lot of other shapes that are stronger than that. That's what begging the question is, giving an answer to something that is a much bigger question that we know is unanswered. And so a novelistic title, will God bring justice when the wick is smoldering? Will God bring justice when the reed is broken? Do we learn from this story whether God is merciful, whether there is salvation? You don't know. It's up for the reader to decide. It begs the reader to answer the question. That's why the title was chosen, kind of a 2-part answer, if that makes any sense. Anyone else have any comments, criticisms? Sure.
I wish I had your vocabulary.
Oh, well, that brings up a good point. Is there a reason where unusual words should be used? I feel like they are very useful for the purpose of precision, but it also makes for more interesting reading. When I'm reading something, I like to come across stuff I've never come across before. A lot of times it's words, a lot of times it's combinations of words, or like, I brought you an example This is James Joyce. Writing in Finnegan's Wake, which is a story about Finnegan who had a wake. Okay. If I can find it, I was going to read it to you. I can't find it. Anyway, James Joyce, you have to have an annotated companion to everything by James Joyce because you have absolutely no idea what's happening. But it's a lot of fun to go through it, figure out what he means, what his lists, because he's another lister, what his lists all set forth, what he's referring to, all of his weird literary allusions that he puts in there. It makes for entertaining reading. It's more challenging, but it's more interesting. So I knew that I'd be in some ways criticized for using, they call it $4 words. But I thought the words were perfect. Sometimes just the number of syllables in them fit in the way you wanted a sentence to sound when you wrote it all out. Because all that goes into what I think a sentence should be. It should have a rhythm to it that is easy to read and fun to read, interesting to read. And sometimes a certain word will do that, even though it might be an obscure word. But it also, I thought, presented something of a challenge to the reader to go through and look. And these days, it's so easy to look things up. If you get your book on Kindle, you just press the word, and all of a sudden the definition just pops right up. So I wasn't as hesitant to use unusual words as I might have been had they not served my purpose. I don't know if that's an answer to your question or your criticism. Well,
You address some themes in here that are things that a lot of people know about but don't often get talked about out loud. Prejudices, people's deep feelings about this group and that group. Did you get people saying, hey, you shouldn't be talking about this stuff in public this way? And do you think there's a value to discussing these things more openly?
The question is, was it troubling to anybody that some of these prejudices, intergroup prejudices, to say them out loud? And even if I did, I think the question is there a value in saying them out loud? Finally, I have received criticism from people that it's racist and that it's anti-Semitic. As a matter of fact, there was a guy who owns a shop who I went to high school with, and I asked him to have a book signing for me, and he said, no, it's the Jewish part is too racist. But having already given 2 book clubs entirely of Jewish members presentations who enjoyed the book, and who, in fact, as I discussed with you, Mr. Fland, discussed with Joe Friend and Jack Zoller, who loved the book and gave me information that I was able to use and to reinforce the truth to the extent it is in here. So I do think there's a value to saying this stuff out loud. I do think there's a value in discussing these prejudices that are not mentioned. In my own family, they were barely ever mentioned. My father's parents were Protestant Americans. My mother's family were Catholic to the core. And my grandparents didn't like each other, ever. And I never really understood as a child. We always knew that, but we never understood as children why that was. And it was that Catholic Protestant thing that still existed in that generation. And I see it now that it still exists in my generation. And I would be interested if more people would bring it up. I think the value in it is that it's interesting. I don't think that the world is going to be saved or changed or nudged or altered, or the political landscape is going to shift for any reason. But I think the value of it is that it's interesting in understanding human behavior. That's the value of the book. Is not supposed to be political, and I don't think it is. And you're not supposed to draw any political conclusion about whether one group is superior to the other. But you're supposed to be, my hope is that you would understand that there is that tension, there is that antipathy, and it governs behavior even today. And that's interesting to me. And cramming it into a novel is the only way I knew how to do it. So I'm not a historian or a sociologist. That's why I think it's valuable, and that's what I think the value lies. Yes, ma'am.
I thought it was interesting that the only really likable good guy was the guy that ended up shooting everybody.
That's a major criticism of the book. Everybody in the book is a despicable person who behaves very, very badly, except for our hero. And he's the one that's suffering the most. He's the bruised reed. He's the smoldering wick. He does not survive. Is Isaiah telling us the truth when he says that God is going to bring justice, no matter how bruised the reed may be? But you also had to make it true to the story of the sniper incident at the Howard Johnson, when the sniper actually did die, as we all remember. Remember, they killed him. A helicopter came over, shot him on the roof. They left him up there all night long because they thought there was a second guy crawling around the air conditioning ducts or something. It was insane. I remember it ruined my Sunday because I was scheduled to go see the Harlem Globetrotters at Loyola Fieldhouse, and my father says, I don't want you going there. There's a sniper on the loose. I was going to see the Harlem Globetrotters. This is way more important than the sniper on the roof. And I never saw the Harlem Globetrotters ever again for the rest of my life.
I agree with you. If you don't talk about a prejudice, it's going to be more powerful. I mean, unspoken, unwritten rules are more powerful than written laws. And talking about it allows you to do something about it to try to eliminate it.
The comment there is for the camera. That talking about these prejudices is actually constructive in the long run. Maybe so. I certainly like to think that the novel might get people thinking along those lines. I'm not sure they will. I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to solve any social problems that we have, but at least thinking about them a little bit, understanding the way hierarchies work. It might be useful in Lambeth House when you see some of those hierarchies developing in Lambeth House, just like they did in Valencia and Montessori School and everywhere else that we've ever been in our entire lives. Hierarchies develop. Human beings cannot help the instinct to look down on one another, or aspire to look down on one another, or to become king of Carnival, or to become king of Bacchus, or to become king of Endymion. This, just all over the city, and the city has more of it than I think any other American city could possibly have. It does not have the kind of homogeneity that allows for peaceful coexistence. We don't have homogeneity here. We got Catholics and blacks and Protestants and S.J. Peters from Philadelphia, of all places, buying up the Garden District. This is insane. It's crazy. It's fabulous. Yes?
I'm from
so much because I learned about Jewish people, the different kinds of Jewish people. I learned about the ball, what goes into that ball, and the reception afterwards. I mean, it was such a learning experience. And of course, when you live in a town of Cody, Wyoming, you know, you don't have anything. C.J. Box is our hero.
Is that what?
C.J. Box is our hero.
Oh, yeah.
But to hear this, it's just been wonderful because you put it out there in a manner that can be understood. And I want to thank you so much for that.
Thank you. The comment there for the camera was that it was an education for her because she's from Cody, Wyoming. I imagine seeing what the hell was going on down here from Cody, Wyoming, you might say, these people are insane. It's impossible to. Maybe the book goes some small way into explaining, and I think maybe that's what your comment reflects, to understanding the way they behave. You had made a comment about the debutante party. I don't know if you read the book, but it's a debutante party that takes place at the Latter Library. Every debutante party has to outdo the previous debutante party. It has to be bigger, more expensive, more outrageous. There have to be more crazy ideas coming down. When you're writing satire like this book attempts to do, satirizing a debutante party is very difficult. It's very hard to exaggerate what goes on at a debutante party. There's no amount of money where you can put down and say, oh, they would never spend that. That's ridiculous. It's just impossible to do. But I tried. And what I tried to do, it tie it into the German Jewish experience, because in this debutante party, the theme was Weimar Germany. That interbellum period between World War I and World War II, when they had a democracy briefly, and Berlin was just this insane place. The citizens thought the government was putting out cocaine in the air. They thought the citizens of Berlin were breathing in cocaine. That was all you could do to explain what was going on. They had a bar, you couldn't get in unless you were a lesbian with a monkey and a monocle. That was the bar. I'm sorry, where's your monocle? I mean, this is how insane Berlin was. So I figured, if you're going to satirize debutante party, maybe Weimar Berlin would be nice, at least to start. So you had to, when you write a description of a debutante party, you got to cater it, you got to get a band, you got to get a place, you got to get everybody there. So all these things go in to the writing of the satirical mise-en-scene of a debutante party in the Weimar Republic. You might remember and this is true of the Weimar Republic, they had parties where they would have a guy starving to death in a glass case. And the big night it was if you could be there when he actually died. That was when you were really swish in Berlin in the 1920s. You witnessed the death of the guy starving in a glass case in the middle of the bar. They also had a bar where they had these vacuum tubes that went all over. And if you saw an attractive person over at a table over there, you bought a little cocaine or a little morphine or maybe a playing card or a flower and stick it in the vacuum tube and send it over. And that was what made this particular bar special. So I said, why don't we put that in the debutante party? If nothing's going to be too outrageous, let's have vacuum tubes. So they were at the Latter and Bloom, the Latter Library. They had vacuum tubes, and they were going over them. They had a 20s band playing and everything. So, you're welcome. Anybody?
What was your role in the Bradford building? Bradford building, what was your role in that? There's a whole section about the Bradford building.
Oh, the Bradford building, the reason why that was discussed, the question is, what was the role of the Bradford building in the story or in my personal life? The Bradford building, I'm trying to remember now, was designed by Leon Weiss. Leon Weiss also designed the Pontchartrain Hotel. Leon Weiss was an Eastern European Jewish guy who married into the Dreyfus family, a Western European Jewish family. Scandal, unbelievable scandal. Mr. Dreyfus, who had a house on Audubon Place, you know where Tom Benson lives? That was old man Dreyfus's house. He had made it. He was in every carnival organization you could think of. He had a daughter who had learned to stay as far away from what they called the Litvak community, Litvak, Litvak. That means the Eastern European Jews, the scummy ones. His daughter marries Leon Weiss. So I had this whole discussion about the architect of the Bradford Building and the architect of the Pontchartrain involved in this conflict between the Eastern European and the German Jews. At the same time, the wife of our uptown stockbroker was having a fundraiser to save the Bradford Building for the Arts Council. And the Arts Council had somehow gotten ownership of this old Leon Weiss building built in 1913, still there. And she was trying to raise money, and she actually had an invitation she was writing. You've seen these invitations for the fundraisers. I won't go over it, but typical uptown housewife, she's chairman of a fundraiser for an arts-related organization to save a building that it's unsavable. This is just a big money pit. In real life, the Arts Council ends up even folds completely because of the cost of the Bradford Building. And the Bradford Building, as you know, has gone through multiple owners and development ideas. For a while there, it was going to be a place for artisans to come, and each artisan would have a stall. Nobody showed up. They scrapped that idea. Then the Brennan family was going to make it a museum for the culinary arts. That one went by the wayside. I don't know what it is now, but anyway, the Bradford Building was a reason to discuss its architect, the conflict between the marriage of the architect and the Dreyfus girl, and then for a fundraiser for the uptown housewife whose husband is cheating on her and buying lottery tickets because he can't keep up with the Joneses. That was why the Bradford Building was useful.
Well, thank you so much, Rick.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
I enjoyed your book, and we hope you'll come again.
Oh, absolutely.
Write another book.
Yeah. It only takes 5 years, so thank you all very kindly. Wonderful place, wonderful group.